Hi, everyone, and welcome back. We are joined again by Gilbert Doctorow, a historian, international affairs analyst, and author of The War Diaries, The Russia-Ukraine War. So, welcome back. It's always great to see you.
It's a pleasure.
So, as the Ukraine war appears to be entering its, if not final stage, at least the final stages, at least some things appears to be moving in that direction, it's worth exploring what the relationship between the Europeans and Russia would look like after the war. And I guess a good case study would be to look at some of the comments coming from Finland. That is, the meeting between Trump and the Europeans in the White House was interesting for a variety of reasons. But the interactions with President Stubb of Finland was interesting, I guess, because he made several comments. He referred to Finland's own historical experience with peace with Russia, but also the possibility of renewing relations with Russia after the end of this war. I was wondering what you read into this comment.
I think Stubbs' remarks got far more attention at high levels in Russia than it did in the West. In the West, well, I, for one, was confused by what he meant. Was this supposed to be a recommendation to Ukraine to see how well Finland had done after a nasty war with Russia? That is to say, Finland's participation on the side of Hitler against Russia was ended by a 1944 peace between the Soviet Union and Finland, in which Finland ceded a lot of territory to Russia. So that could sound like it was a recommendation to Kiev as to what to do. On the other hand, as after some thought, and with reflecting on what Sergei Lavrov had to say about it the day after Stubb made his remarks, I come to a different conclusion which bears on your question, how Europe will deal with Russia as the war closes. It is important to note the remarks, the comments on Stubb that were made by Lavrov in an interview that was on Russian state television the next day. In this, he reminded everyone what was that 1944 agreement all about? What did it contain? Why was it concluded? It wasn't just that Finland was changing alliances in an abstract or formal way. It is the fact that Finland was an active participant in the atrocities that the Germans oversaw and encouraged in the siege of Leningrad, that they did various acts of barbarism, which the Russians have slowly taken out of their archives. The Russians have a lot of goods on many countries in Europe, including the level of participation of the Belgians or the French in the military forces of Germany on Russian territory, which outweigh in their figures anything resembling the forces of the opposition resistance movements in these countries, which everybody has celebrated, including the Russians, formally till now. Well, so they're taking things out of the archives, which are not very pretty, but would have gotten in the way of reestablishing normal relations with the various countries that participated with Germany in the assault on Russia. In the case of Finland, he was mentioning, yes, they committed these atrocities, and some images of this were put up on this television screen, on Russian state television. And they concluded in 1944, seeing which way the war was going, which was coming to a conclusion against Germany, they decided to change sides, which they did at a considerable price. But that agreement, that peace treaty, had conditions which Mr. Stubb didn't mention, but Mr. Lavrov did. Precisely, Finland was obliged to maintain in perpetuity neutrality. It was obliged not to enter into any military bloc directed against Russia, and there you have it. They joined NATO. So Mr. Stubb did not go into that aspect of what his country had agreed to. But let me move on from that to further consideration of what he may have meant. It came out a day later when he said, without any particular reference why he was saying it, that Finland sought to reestablish relations with Russia. One could read between the lines normal relations with Russia after the war ended, because after all, we are neighbors, direct neighbors. Well, that was quite a signal of a change in position. The Russians immediately pounced on it and asked, well, why do you wait? You can reestablish relations with us right now. We're not the ones who broke them off. You are. He didn't respond to that challenge. But it does indicate something that I think we will see a lot of in the coming weeks as the war comes to its conclusion, which will be a military defeat that is universally recognized, and even in Ukraine. So some sort of a treaty will be negotiated. And that is that the smaller countries will probably be the first ones to leave this 27 nation wide consolidated opinion on Russia that the EU has maintained for most of the last 3 years. They are the ones who are most to suffer by the weakened economies resulting from the sanctions and their impact on inflation and on jobs in Western Europe. I live in Belgium, and I can tell you that right now, the country is experiencing severe economic pain. We're not far from one of the premier commercial avenues, boulevards in Brussels, the Avenue Louise, and there are a lot of empty restaurants and storefronts. I am sitting now in Knokke. Knokke is the most elegant, most prestigious resort on the North Sea, on the sea coast of Belgium, and there are vacancies on the Digue, on the seafront, and on a few of the major retail districts. This is unthinkable. This is the most prosperous part of Belgium, and there are vacancies. There are restaurants that have gone out of business, some of them rather large. So I have a relative whose employment has been related to, as a son-in-law, whose employment is related to marketing. And he was meeting with his confrère, with his fellow practitioners in marketing, preparing films for advertising and marketing. And they're all suffering. Marketing is the first thing to go in the budget lines of corporations when they see the economy sinking. So here in little Belgium, and in a place like Finland, and in many of the smaller countries, which have been dependent on Germany as a locomotive to keep them all doing well, now that Germany is officially in recession, continuing in recession, they are all suffering, and they cannot afford to continue the sanctions on Russia, particularly after the war ends, and there's no logical reason for them to continue it. Even in France, I wonder how long Mr. Macron can sing his aggressive songs about Russia and the coalition of the willing and so forth. He's about to face the fall of his government, as the Prime Minister Bayrou has announced that it's impossible for him to accept changes to the budget, which he has prepared a strict budget, because the country now is experiencing a severe decline in its creditworthiness and is paying a premium price even above Italy and Greece and other rather weak economies that we traditionally speak of as having high bond rates, because the markets do not give them good grades for managing the economy. France is now above paying higher rates of interest on its bonds than those countries. This cannot continue because France will be penalized by it. It may find itself in the arms of the IMF if this goes on much longer. Therefore, considering these weaknesses, France is among the big countries is the worst case, although Britain isn't doing very well. The Chancellor of the Exchequer is facing severe criticism because their budget is going into serious deficit, and they have been unable to cut costs, and so they face the very unpleasant task of raising taxes. So these are 2 out of 3 countries that are facing up to credit problems, all resulting from a weak economy and from the enhanced military expenses that they are assuming to wage war against Russia in 2029. Well, these are, I say, the big countries are just beginning to see it. The smaller countries are feeling it, but now, and Mr. Stubb, I think, is the first swallow here to fly by in the changing direction of politics within the EC, the European Union, over relations with Russia.
It's certainly interesting that, yeah, after the war is done and everyone, or the hardened position has to be loosened up, that this could be something that fractures the Europeans as well. It's often pointed out that once the war is over, the Americans might leave, but it's also interesting that the Europeans might end up taking very different approaches. But who do you think would be the most hardliners within Europe, and who would run fastest to try to mend some ties?
Well, the mending of ties, as I say, will be the small countries who are badly hurt by the weakening economy of Germany in particular, because they were so dependent on its maintaining the GDP growth in Europe as a whole. The hardliners, well, this 2 days ago, there was a 2-page broadsheet interview with a professor of European, specialist in European security at the University of Lille in France. That was featured on the most important economic or finance daily in Belgium, the Eckert La Bourse. And there you had the logic for the hardliners. Note that Belgium always French-speaking Belgium always looks to what the French are doing and saying. They take them as the étalon, as the high standard for what should center in public discussion in Belgium itself. And this Leo professor was saying he was quite intelligent and quite open with his observations on Mr. Trump and Europeans' handling of Trump, which was interesting because it contradicts with what many of my peers, and myself included, have thought about the European understanding of Trump, that they were taken in, they don't see that he is using them. No. This professor was acknowledging that Trump may very well be trying to deceive them and trying to string them along, but their response to that falls within certain limits, what they can do. One is they can turn their back on him, or they can directly oppose him, or 2, they can humor him and throw carrots to him, as the professor said, and show him every politesse, every sign of respect, which they did, but without themselves believing that this would change his course, that there would be a pivot back to the pro-European, anti-Russian positions. The logic is different. The logic is, don't do anything to upset his plans. Let Mr. Putin do that for us, because they don't believe that Putin will follow the recommendations or diktat of Trump regarding a meeting with Zelensky and an early conclusion of what will now be a peace treaty rather than a ceasefire. So they expect that to fall through, and they want Putin to take the brunt of Mr. Trump's dissatisfaction, rather than to point to them as having spoiled it, something that would have happened if they hadn't stood in the way. So that is a more nuanced approach to what Europe is doing than I have seen anyone else say, and I take my hat off to him. At the same time, his overall logic, I think, explains very well what's going on in the minds of Mr. Macron and people around him, or Mr. Starmer, namely that in no way should this war end in a treaty that compromises Ukraine's sovereignty, its ability to conclude alliances with anyone it wants, its ability to maintain an army of the kind that it wants for its security, and so forth. With the idea that Ukraine will always be a reserve force of 800,000-man army, ready to help Europe at any moment. That is to say, very close to what Mr. Zelensky has been saying, that he is a defender of Europe. If, for example, says this professor, the Russians should move on Estonia, well, we could open a second front with the help of Ukraine. So that is the logic that I have, and it's exactly what Mr. Putin had in mind when he opened the special military operation, to put to make that kind of relationship impossible by imposing neutrality, limitations on the Ukrainian size of its army, and denazification, say regime change. There you have it. As I said, I take this professor from Lille as being a very good exponent and explainer of what is probably going through the minds of many of his peers in the academic advisors to Mr. Macron, and probably their equivalents in Germany and in England.
Yeah, Stoltenberg, as when he was NATO Secretary General, said something similar to that. If the Ukrainians are victorious, then the benefit would be to have, as a partner state, an army with hundreds of thousands of men who would be battle hardened on the Russian border, who would then function as a shield, more or less. So, so I think this is what the Europeans want at the end of this war. They can't accept a neutral Ukraine, which can't be used as an instrument, possibly to deter. But this is why I found the comments by Alexander Stubb interesting as well, because his argument was more or less that Russia cannot be appeased, it must be contained. And this was kind of the lessons that they had with, historical lessons they had with Russia. But it seems that that it would be the opposite, because from my perspective, the main lesson that should be learned is the security competition you should avoid on the borders of other great powers, because a lot of Finland's experience with the Soviet Union was exactly back in 1939, when the Soviets feared that Finland was too close to, well, Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg, and the Germans could use this in the future as a northern flank against them. So they had fought in the Winter War, but after this, the Finns indeed they did join the invasion of the Soviet Union on the side of Hitler, partly to regain their territory, of course. But when they were defeated, they accepted a peace that entailed territorial concessions, but also permanent neutrality. And the whole idea then would be not to be an instrument of security competition between the great powers. So take yourself out of this, and by doing this, the Soviets wouldn't have anything to fear from Finland, and they wouldn't have to go against the Finns. And to a large extent, the story of Finland is a great success story of neutrality. This massive border, yet no more problems through permanent neutrality. I mean, it's pragmatic, it shows neutrality works, they ensure their independence, sovereignty, peace. So often people would then look to Finland. Why wouldn't this be a good model for Ukraine? But instead of making Ukraine into Finland, we're doing the opposite. Finland is becoming a frontline like Ukraine. And this is the whole point. When Finland joined NATO in 2023, they changed this power balance. So I guess when President Stubb says that they want to revive relations after this war, to what extent is it possible to go back to the same? Because now Finland is the largest NATO frontline against the Russians, and the Russians are rebuilding the Leningrad military district is a response to this reality, which means that the border with Finland, as it's ended its neutrality, will become more militarized. We have countries like the Baltic states, Poland talking about Finland in NATO allows Baltic Sea to become a NATO lake. We're seeing more preparation for a fight or confrontation in the Arctic. It does seem that Finland is becoming a frontline state, though. So how possible is it to actually go back, try to restore relations as they were?
Well, Russia has had relations with NATO countries. It has very good relations, or reasonably good relations, with Turkey, which has the largest military force within NATO. So I don't think that being in NATO by itself excludes having a normalization and even very good commercial relations with Russia. That to hold up Turkey as Exhibit A. As for what has happened to Finland, I think they are probably the biggest losers economically in this conflict with Russia. We speak about Germany. That is always brought out because of the cheap energy resources that it received via the gas pipelines, and also petroleum pipelines. However, Finland is a case of many times over dependence and profitability from its commercial relations with Russia. This goes back to the Soviet period when they were selling, to be honest about it, quite shoddy consumer items to the Russians in exchange for very fine energy resources. And not only. Look, Finland has a very big lumber processing industry, a paper industry, um, uh, and these were heavily dependent on cheap Russian raw logs. There was a big discussion, of course, in Russia about the practical benefits or losses in this type of exchange, and there's no question there was losses. The Finns got the logs, and then they turned it into typing paper or anything else you want to think of, and cellulose and for rayon and the rest of it. And the Russians got small change, and then they received in return leather shoes, which nobody could wear without getting blisters. So I know this as a practical matter. That's what it looked like when you looked at the consumer goods from Finland that were on sale in Russia, in the Soviet Union. They were quite shoddy. They were on the level of what Bulgaria would ship. The Finns' economy, in every respect, was profiting from Russia, and that is inside Finland, and their operations in Russia were profitable. And the Russians wanted it that way. They weren't stupid about this. They were buying this they did with their own Warsaw Pact countries, their control over Eastern Europe. All of these commercial relations were disadvantageous for Russia. And they, again, not because they were stupid, but because they were buying the passivity, the peace with these countries. And it worked to a certain extent. But above a certain extent, these countries were unwilling to sacrifice their identities for the sake of cheap Russian resources. So Finland has suffered enormously, and as I said, taking the example of Turkey, I don't see any reason why their being a member of NATO means necessarily that they have to be on a war footing with Russia.
Well, you mentioned Lavrov's comment that why wait until after the war? We can have diplomatic relations now. It's the Europeans who broke off diplomacy, not the Russians. This is a good point, though, because again, as President Stubb suggested, we can have a renewed dialogue with Moscow, but only after there's been established a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. I guess my first question then would be why? Why would the diplomacy enter after a conflict? Also, to what extent would it be possible if we recognize that this war is, as many have suggested, from Leon Panetta, Boris Johnson, that this is a proxy war indeed. Wouldn't the dialogue be required in order to reach this lasting peace? Because, again, from the Russian perspective, the main problem is that we cancel these agreements for pan-European security, indivisible security. So, again, constructing this Europe without Russia meant redividing the continent, reviving the Cold War, zero-sum logic, and even refusing to then take into account Russian concerns, given that this was a hegemonic peace. But if the Russian thesis is correct, that the consequence of this is that the deeply divided states, be it Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, would then be pulled in both directions in order to wrestle control over them, to see what side of the new dividing lines in Europe. All of this seems to be requiring some agreements between the Europeans and the Russians as well. So to what extent can you actually have a lasting peace unless you have the diplomacy before the peace? I mean, I understood the initial logic that will isolate Russia, this will put pressure, but who's thinking these days that Russia's isolated? With the Americans now talking to Russia, it's just the Europeans. The rest of the world is doing business. They're talking with them. The Americans are trying to improve the bilateral relations. Where does this logic come in then? Because I always make the point, I can understand the Russian position well, I understand the Ukrainians very well, I can understand the Americans, but the Europeans, it doesn't make much sense why they would still boycott diplomacy.
Well, I think Mr. Lavrov was making debating points rather than saying what is constructive, what happens next. I don't think that repairing relations with any of the European countries is really on the top of the agenda for Moscow. I think that its first concern is repairing relations with the United States, and the single most important thing to be fixed with the United States, and say urgently, is an agreement not to let the United States not bring over its intermediate range missiles into Germany in 2026, which is about 5 months from now. That is of vital importance. And you need an agreement with Mr. Trump. After that, they can turn around and look at the European states. But on this whole question of who's who and Russia's relations with Europe and with the United States, I just go back in time. The whole psychology of Russia, or the Soviet Union, was that there were two superpowers, the United States and Russia, and Europe didn't really count. Despite the fact that Russians on the street may consider themselves to be Europeans, did not carry over into the thinking in the Kremlin. They measured themselves against the states. They were all of their descriptions of themselves were in units of the United States. Just as in Australia, I think every distance between cities is measured but is taken by contrast or comparison with the distance between Melbourne and Sydney. It is the basis for making judgments about anything. And our newspapers, populated by journalists who don't have a memory that goes back more than a few weeks, don't understand that this is a persistent element of Russian mentality, particularly official Russian mentality, that the United States is what you measure yourself by, not by these little countries in Europe, even if they're rather big, even if they're Germany. They are a secondary consideration. So first is repair relations with the United States, get this terrible security issue of intermediate range missiles in Europe off the table, and then go after these countries in Europe. And I think they will follow what I've just observed. They will work first with the smaller countries that are more amenable to reason. And once they've facilitated the breakup of the bloc, and facilitated the pursuit of national interests, particularly among the smaller countries, then they can deal with the larger countries. The real tough nut to crack here, of course, will be Germany, because Mr. Merz continues to invest political capital in the confrontation with Russia. And his words are more important than those of Macron because he has the creditworthiness and the ability to build military assets that Mr. Macron does not have.
I just, I guess my last question was on the European strategy, as you suggested, that the goal would be for the Europeans to seemingly just nod along and say, of course, Trump, you're great, we'll follow your excellent peace initiatives. We've never been more optimistic than now. All you have to do is pressure the Russians, to make sure that this is where his negotiation or threats, as this is how he negotiates, goes. I can see a lot of evidence behind this when they began initially to suggest 30-day ceasefire. I remember all the European leaders, they sent out a tweet which was almost identical. They all had the same phrase. The ceasefire, the ball is now in Russia's court. In other words, Putin, Trump, go over there. Now you have to pressure them, knowing that Russia would never accept a ceasefire because it doesn't make any sense without political settlement, and hoping therefore that the diplomacy with the Russians would end up in renewing Trump's commitment to the war and pulling him into the Biden 2.0 or the European camp of a long war with Russia. But now that the ceasefire is out of the question, this becomes a bit more difficult, doesn't it? Because the whole thing appears to be premised on the notion that Russia doesn't really want peace. He's just prolonging the time so it can, gobble up more territory. But if the conditions of Russia were actually met, that is the territorial concessions and the neutrality, what are the Europeans going to do if the Americans and Russians come to a peace and the Europeans then have to try to fight this tooth and nail? I mean, how can they actually stop this from happening?
Well, they can't, and I think they will simply split along the lines I mentioned. Mr. Stubb was being very, very careful, very cautious. He's making baby steps. And if what he said wasn't entirely consistent, this has to be considered, that he can't go too far out of line with his peers. But we will see more of this as the war grinds on and as the Russians come closer to taking the whole of Donetsk, for example, which is they're doing very nicely right now. I think the opinions will change within Europe. There'll be some surprises which countries come out first in an olive branch, but there will have to be a split in Europe. The logic, to my understanding, the logic suggests that, and it's not because the Russians are forcing it; it's because these countries are chafing under the direction given by Germany and by France and by the UK. And finally, we'll revolt against that because it's so much against their interests and the interests of their peoples and their prosperity.
But that also makes me think about the expectations for Ukraine, what comes after this war, because what the Europeans appears to want is to have this hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians prepared to die for Europe, essentially, to be as their active frontline if they have to have a conflict with Russia. But the Ukrainians, obviously, they hope that it would be the Europeans who would come to the aid of Ukraine, not the other way around. Of course, if there would be a military bloc, they wouldn't be mutually exclusive, but then the West, of course, would be pulled into a war, which the Europeans wouldn't do without America. So I guess my point is there's been more voices coming out of Ukraine that what happens after this war, because the Europeans seem to be signaling a lot that we need to keep the war going a bit, so to protect Europe from Russian aggression. So people like Yulia Tymoshenko has made a point that we just pretty much meat for the Europeans. They just want to throw Ukrainians at Russia to buy time for Europe. So in other words, they're kind of understanding that Europe is there not to protect Ukraine, but to use Ukrainians to protect Europe, essentially. So how how would that work after a peace? Because it holds based on the assumption, it seems, that Ukraine will continue to do this forever, that there will be a political consensus to throw Ukrainians at Russia to help the Europeans. It doesn't seem like this would be, well, I can see some flaws in the plan, I guess.
Well, in the musical world, going back 20 years, there was a trend particularly strong in the United States called minimalism. I don't want to propose a one-note symphony here, but I have said several weeks ago that it really is in the Russians' hands to make a proposal that could solve all of these issues. It would take the Europeans, it would give an off-ramp to the Europeans, because if the Ukrainians agree to a settlement, what can they say? And to make the Ukrainians agree to the settlement, Russia just has to say, liberate the $350 or $250 billion in our assets that are frozen, make them available for the reconstruction of the whole of Ukraine, including the part we occupy. And that would end the war. And that would end Mr. Zelensky and his gang. I'm happy to say that I'm not the only one who has been playing this note. It was picked up by a rather reputable and widely read journal in Germany, the Berliner Zeitung. And they repeated this proposal, happily, with attribution to myself. But the point is, it is possible to find solutions if you really want to, and to be a little bit creative here. So I don't think that we are totally blocked. But of course, even if the situation looks rather difficult, and even if Mr. Merz and Mr. Macron and Mr. Stammer are awfully stubborn and are supported by academics like the one who appeared in Equity La Bourse the other day, there are solutions. And there will be an end to this war. The Russians are really approaching the Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. They more or less have Pokrovsk surrounded. They have made some sallies into Pokrovsk. And so I really think the war on the ground in Donbass is measured in weeks, perhaps in months, but not in years anymore. And once the Russians have seized the whole of Donbass, the excuse that Mr. Zelensky gives, that he cannot give up territory that has been conquered, will be removed. He can give it all up, or he can take the first plane out and let his successor give it all up. So there will be an end to this war. It's not going to go on forever. I'm looking to publish volume 2.
Well, that's the frustrating part, that everyone recognizes more or less that the Russians won't give up on Donbass, so they can either appease now or wait until, pull it a few more months until Donbass has been lost and then make the peace. But of course, at that point, Ukraine will be in a much more difficult position, because by that time, much more of Zaporizhia would have been lost, and of course, much more of Ukraine will have been destroyed. Many more men will have died. The ability to reconstruct, everything will have been diminished. So if one was completely rational and you would have leaders with some political weight, they would be able to make the unavoidable deal today, as opposed to having to choose a worse deal tomorrow just because it's politically easier to do. But again, everything about this has frustrated me for the past decade. So I think, they will not go for the best solutions just yet. So
There are symbolic things that are going on. Kramatorsk and Slavyansk are symbolic because they were the cradle of the Russian Renaissance, as they call it, going back to 2014. Their last stand against the onslaught from vastly superior numbers, the Ukrainian military forces, who were sent in to crush precisely this resistance to the new regime in Kiev. There are also, you've mentioned Zaporozhye, but I would add to this Dnipropetrovsk, because the Russians had captured their first towns in that oblast. And as they approach Dnipropetrovsk, or as the Ukrainians call it, Dnipro, let's remember what that is. That is the home ground of Kolomoisky, the oligarch who owned the largest bank in Ukraine, who owned the Ukrainian airlines, and who virtually controlled the government. and who financed the Azov battalions and the other violent nationalists. And so it has great symbolic value also that the Russians are marching on Dnipro. The Ukrainians are being battered, which is not to say that there isn't a real war. There is. And when you watch Russian television and you listen to the reporters, their war correspondents who are traveling along close to the front, and they have to leave their vehicles and they have to proceed on foot because the vehicles are just a trap for attack drones. So it's not as though this is, the Ukrainians are all running from the front with it. The Russians are not approaching in large contingents. They're approaching small groups on foot and or on motor scooters or motorcycles, precisely because of the drone threat. This nature of warfare is still underreported, and it has changed the character of this war dramatically. That said, they are proceeding in small groups. They are penetrating Ukrainian settlements, taking them by surprise, and while the Ukrainian defenders flee to the next town where they can make a stand. It is a tough war, and all notion that the Russians are doing this according to a fixed schedule. Of course, that is not happening. They're moving to where the weak points are, where the Ukrainians cannot cover the whole line, and therefore on their way to the weak points to suffer the least losses on their side, because attackers always face the threat of greater losses than defenders. It's a slow-moving scene, but where it's headed is very clear.
Well, thank you again for your input. I thought this is quite interesting to look at. Well, it's worth starting to think about what Europe will look like after this war. And I think this question is also one of the reasons why the Europeans are so stubborn in terms of, hoping not to end the war, given a lot of the uncertainties of what actually will follow. But as always, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks for inviting me.